Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's March 13, 2025, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, I'm exchanging with Tarek Souki, an energy and professional executive entrepreneur who was involved over the past 15 years with two well-known LNG export companies, Cheniere Energy and Tellurian. Hi, Tarek. I'm so happy, honored that you can join the Energy Vista podcast.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Good. So let's delve right into the topic of the day, which is US LNG. And I'm very curious about the financing of these projects. Because with the Trump administration coming back to office and with the ambition of unleashing American liquid gold, we know that it's not that easy, even if the permitting is now not an issue, not a challenge anymore. There are still some pending challenges, obstacles for US LNG. One of them is financing. And you've been dealing with two big projects in the past. Tell us a little bit, like from your perspective, what's the most complicated for independent energy companies when they want to develop an LNG project to export LNG to the rest of the world?
I think there's a lot to unpack there, right? And I think this is very timely given that this week is Sarah Week. And if you look at any of the media and all of the things that are going on, your LinkedIn feed, whatever else, in terms of what people are saying, it's all talking about, exactly what you just mentioned about the Trump administration and how permitting is supposed to be easier and how we're ready to go. I mean, everything is abuzz with that. And as usual, as you would expect around a big energy conference, everybody is being very positive and very bullish on what it is they're going to be able to accomplish in the current environment. Having said that, and having been through, as you said, two projects or two companies and three projects, really, it's amazing how many people think you just show up and build one of these things, right? And while the permitting process itself has become, I will say, more open, a FERC permit is still a massive undertaking that costs $60 to $100 million. Requires thousands and thousands of pages, all kinds of modeling, all kinds of safety checks, engineering.
And navigating the change in procedures. And we know that depending on the administration, we've seen many changes with the permitting process also between FERC, DOE,
Certainly
timing.
with DOE, FERC a little bit less because you
Yeah.
nominate the commissioners and then you get assigned a caseworker, and that person is not a commissioner. They're a government employee. They don't really have any political affiliation, really. I mean, nothing public. Their job is really to look at your application, your filing, and proceed. Now,
I
the
mean,
administration.
the mention for FERC has been to consider or not the full cycle of CO2 emissions for an LNG project, which in the latest permits, that has dragged some of those green lights.
Oh, for sure. And actually, I mean, when this all started sort of in 2008, when people were, or 2009, when people were looking at doing liquefaction for the first time, you were kind of inventing it as you were going along. And now you've got an established precedent. And we've seen as a few people who've made mistakes on their permitting, who haven't filed for enough footprint, who went for under nameplate instead of full nameplate, and then realized not only can I produce nameplate, but I can produce above nameplate, and then that causes some violations potentially.
Just for our audience, which is not familiar with this jargon, it's whether you produce a certain volume of LNG which goes beyond your technical capacity of the project.
Right. Whatever your engineering company says, this is how much you can produce.
Right.
That's your nameplate capacity. Oftentimes, many of those projects can produce above nameplate, particularly in cooler months. Sort of like anywhere from November to March, they
Yeah.
can produce
So
well above
in
nameplate.
terms of cost, you were mentioning like the whole permitting process in itself, where you need the lawyers and you need the paperwork and all this. But so the latest US LNG projects that took final investment decision, the amount was about like between 10 to 20 billion dollars, right?
Yeah, so I would say today, I mean, it's great. Venture Global went public and has put this out in front of everybody. They're saying Plaquemines is going to cost them about $1,200 per ton. It's a 20 million ton facility, so that puts the price tag for their 20 million tons at about $24 billion. Yeah, we can sort of lift the cover off of that and see what's in there, how much of that is construction cost, how much of it is the upfront cost, how much of it is owner's costs that will come in at different points, and then how much of it is financing costs. And then that's another thing. So you talked about wanting to get into the financing bits of it, which we can do. But this is also in an environment where money has become much more expensive these days, right?
Mhm.
And so the capital markets have changed. And then beyond that, the business model also has not kept pace with the changes in the capital markets. So there are a lot of things at play here that actually, I think if I learned anything over the last 15 years is there are so many factors at play all the time that you have to be on top of, you have to be ready to change with, that it's a huge undertaking to build one of these projects.
Right. So, staying a little bit more in detail about the financing, how many banks, like for example, like a typical LNG project that is not bankrolled by a deep pocket company, an IOC, or that is not led by a sovereign fund from a national government? Tell us a little bit the different steps. Like, what do you need to gather?
So you have to have both your equity and your debt identified. And it depends on how you raise it. If you're a public company, if you go to private equity, um, the debt process is a little bit more straightforward. If you're going to do it as a project development, it's going to be in the form of secured debt at a project level. Basically, if anything goes wrong with your projects, the banks will own it. But you have to understand that you will have to get a credit rating to do that. And in order to get a credit rating, you go to your rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, Fitch. They evaluate your contract structure. They evaluate your parent company, and if there are any other encumbrances, they evaluate the amount of equity versus the amount of debt that you're trying to get, and what your coverage ratios are going to be, and then they assign you a rating. Most typically, you will be in a double B sort of area, maybe triple B, but very rarely in the development stage will you be triple B. You'll probably be double B. And you have to understand what the depth of capital markets is right there. So if to get double B rating, you probably have about 10, somewhere between $8 to $10 billion of debt available to you in the double B market at any given time, if your project looks attractive. So
And the banks, one of the criteria that the banks are looking for is enough long-term contracts for the projects, right?
yes, that is a big factor in all of
And
this.
historically, they were looking at least the commitment of 80% of the project under long-term contract for a US LNG project.
I think given a set of pricing, that's correct, right? Now, if you had really good pricing on your contract, then you could probably have less of your project committed, because really what they do is they look at all your revenue minus all your costs, and whatever's left over for debt service afterwards. If the ratio is high enough, then if you have 50% contracted, that would be fine, but you have to have a high enough ratio. uh,
Right.
so it all
So
boils down to that. But yes, for us, when we were at Cheniere, we were 80% contracted on the first project.
it seems that some projects elsewhere, like if we take the example of the expansion of Qatar, they don't seem to be at all fully contracted yet, and still they go ahead with construction, right?
Mhm.
It's a different business model. Would you say that the US is at the disadvantage when it comes to financing these projects? And do you think there is a role here for the US government, especially under the Trump administration, which is much more supportive and want the US in this role of a larger exporter and unleashing all this bonanza?
So I think I'd answer that in two pieces. So certainly Qatar has an advantage over an unrated development company in the United States in terms of wanting to build their project. Qatar, has a sovereign risk associated with it. They're per capita one of the, if not the richest countries in the world. And now they have 20 years of LNG experience behind them, so they know how to build all of this stuff. For them to raise capital, it's very easy. There are many institutions that are more than willing to give them the money to build all this, and plus they have cash flow from their existing operations. They can do a lot of this themselves. The United States, I will say, has the most robust capital market system in the world, right? So they have a huge advantage from that perspective. You have, billions and billions of dollars available in the United States to build all kinds of things. Your problem is in the US, you have a business model that you have to adopt in order to make your financial institutions comfortable. Qatar had to do some bit of that when they did the early Ras Laffan, right? I mean, they had to basically, it's funny to think about it, but some of the business model for Ras Laffan was selling LNG to the United States when Henry Hub was, at $5. If we can imagine that all of like the first Ras Laffan was built on the premise that your downside case was you're going to ship all your cargoes to America and get
And
$5.
actually, they were supposed to come to the first Cheniere facility, which was at the time Sabine Pass, but as a regasification terminal.
Exactly, and that was all. And we had we had discussed a contract with Qatar that we actually passed on at the time at something like 98% Henry Hub. That was our purchase price that we'd been discussing, and then the market turned before we ever executed. But I mean, when you go back in history, you kind of roll your eyes at the kind of deals that today, oh my God, you'd kill yourself for something like that. And back then, an entire project was built on the premise that you could achieve that.
Yeah.
Today, if you're not at Henry Hub plus, I mean, everybody tells you 250 will pass, but that's wishful thinking. I'm watching all of this. Anybody who's not north of $3 on their Henry Hub contract they're not going to make any money in this game. Costs are way too high these days.
Yeah. So I was asking because some countries have they have an infrastructure fund, right, to support their companies. So the government is not directly investing in these projects, but they are supporting the companies to invest in these projects, right? Like in Japan, for example, you have different infrastructure funds. Do you think there is a place in the US for those kind of organizations?
I mean, look, we have all the private equity and infrastructure funds you could possibly want in the United States. But again,
Yeah, but do you think these funds have a geopolitical agenda? Meaning, do you think they would support US LNG projects based also on the benefits that they see for the US to export to the rest of the world?
no.
Or no?
No, and at the end of the day, even the global infrastructure funds, they need to make a return on their capital, right? They're not just giving away the money for nothing, and there'll be some serious conditions on what that money is and how you're going to pay it back. I mean, at the end of the day, you might have a bit more latitude if you're a sovereign, if the government of, I don't know, Japan wants something to happen and they're willing to backstop it, sure, then you have the faith and credit of the Japanese government. But that's your counterparty, right? I mean, even the Japanese government with a AAA rating isn't going to go sanction something where they can't make a return for it. I don't see why they would do that. But in the US, that's all you're going to do, right? You have to look at, does the project make money? So all you can do is all the US government can do is try to make available the cheapest amount of money possible for projects to be able to thrive. In a normal administration, I would say you can't even you can't even favor one project over another. Technically, you're not supposed to in the United States. You're supposed to basically facilitate conversations with all projects equally. And then maybe you give a wink and the nod and say, but if you really want something, that's the one that you want to deal with, or that one. Under this administration, given that I just watched Donald Trump market a bunch of Teslas on the White House lawn yesterday, you know, those old rules can kind of go out the window sometimes, right? I mean, if I were like Ford or GM or any of these other car companies, I would be like, what about us? You know, why aren't you marketing our cars on the White House lawn if you're going to market, you know, Teslas?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and we saw Chris Wright also, I think, at the one of the announcements from Venture Global recently. I mean, that's not new, right? There has been always like even at, I guess, at the startup of Sabine Pass as a liquefaction plant, you know, some members of the U.S. government were there, federal, local governments. I mean, there has always been some kind of support, right?
Yeah, sure. So I make the distinction between the two, right? So when we opened Sabine Pass Regas,
Right.
we had the then senator from the junior senator from Louisiana, David Vitter, was there. The Secretary of Energy was there. We had, you know, then we had everybody in rank and file from, you know, the secretary being the senior ranking person to the head of the Louisiana pilots being, you know, sort of the more junior. They all spoke, but that was there more to open the ceremony, celebrate the fact that, you know, $2 billion had gone into Louisiana to build a project that, you know, you're going to employ 100 to 150 people on a long-term basis, that there's a multiplier effect. And I'm sure, I mean, when Sabine Pass opened up for liquefaction, it was, you know, it was even bigger because it was $12 billion that had gotten spent, and the multiplier effect was huge. And entire communities benefited in ways they'd never benefited before down in the region for it. So they come out in support of that because it's job creations. But my point on the government is it's not going to say, oh, look, there are these 4 projects. You guys should talk to this project.
Yeah, they'll pick a winner, right?
Yeah, they don't pick winners.
Mm-hmm.
They're not supposed to pick winners. Let's say that.
So without picking on one specific project, we know that there is a lot of rumors and chatter around Venture Global right now.
Yeah.
They recently started an IPO. The share dropped significantly, I think more than minus 60% since the opening, since going public. There has been in the past some litigations, arbitrations still ongoing. Is Venture Global a disruptor because they found a new business model that nobody else advanced before, which is a modular construction and cutting costs heavily, or are they a cheater? Like how should we think about them? You know, without going too much into the negativity here, but I think European customers, right, have questions. Can they still trust the US and US companies? We've seen all those debates going on since the project started, Calcasieu Pass and now Plaquemine LNG.
So I think they are a disruptor, but they're not but not for the reasons you mentioned. Because if you look at the modular technology, first of all, that's Baker Hughes that put out the modular technology. Elba Island was the first one to do that.
Which is a project now where Shell is behind the project.
That's right, but they use, you know, modular small trains, and I think the execution on that, I don't think it makes much of a difference, right? I mean, if they've just come out and said that Plaquemines is going to cost them $1,200 a ton, I bet if you ask Woodside what Louisiana LNG is going to cost them, they're going to tell you it's going to be something similar. But, you know, Woodside has actually a cost of capital advantage because they have a better credit rating for themselves. That's how Sempra, for instance, has been able to do their projects, you know, at all, is because their cost of equity capital is very low compared to a development company that has equity capital, you know, cost of 20% or more. No, I think they've disrupted the market in a way that they drove prices way, way, way down, right? So when Cheniere offered its first contract to BG Group, it was at 115% Henry Hub plus 225. That was the sweetheart deal that they got. Then GasNat was 249.
GasNat
Then
from Spain,
GasNat from Spain, that's now Naturgy. And then Gale and Kogas were both at $3. This was all public information, so it was all in the public domain. And then when we did Corpus Christi, because it was a completely green.
Just to explain a little appendix, so it's the cost of Henry Hub price, which is the price of natural gas plus the cost of liquefaction, and that's put together is the cost of US LNG.
Yeah, so 115% Henry Hub plus your adder of, for Cheniere, it was between 225 and 350 between its two projects, right? That was the cost of liquefaction.
And Venture Global, but what did they offer for their first clients?
So from what I've heard, because of their information was not public and they've never published it, was 175 for their sweetheart deal. So the liquefaction fee of 175. And I don't think ever much above 210, 220 on Plaquemines or any of their other projects. And it forced every other project that was trying to compete. So, us when we were at Tellurian, Sempra at Port Arthur, and then, next decade with Rio Grande, all of them had to kind of offer the same thing, right? Energy Transfer with Lake Charles, which that project's been around forever, and they haven't been able to come off the ground because at the end of the day, you need to have enough revenue to be able to pay all your expenses, and then you have to be able to pay your debt service, and then you have to have a return to shareholders. And if it's not your own equity, then you also need to have a return to your private equity.
So we know that in order to get a return, what's now acknowledged is that Venture Global got very lucky because the Ukraine invasion happened by Russia and the prices of natural gas skyrocketed, especially in Europe. And as a result, they were able to sell spot cargoes at a very high price, delaying the commercial startup of their long-term contracts. So they recovered a lot from their investments thanks to the high prices of the spot LNG cargoes.
They did, and so from what I can tell from what their public filings say, they've plowed most of that back into their projects, and and haven't really reduced the debt burden that they have. So the upshot of that is, for a time, it was legit that they did that, right? The contract would have said you can commission for this long. There's a narrowing window process in every LNG contract that says, if it takes us this long to build, we have to give you notice at this point to say it's going to be between, this 180-day period, then it's 90 days, then it's 30 days, and you narrow until you target the first week of delivery. Up until the windowing mechanism, once you pass that, then it got into foul territory, and that's where the arbitration started. This is where their customers decided to sue them, to say after the windowing mechanism, you declared force majeure on the project and refuse to start our contracts. When I'm saying, how can you declare force majeure when you're actually selling, a commercial amount of project or cargoes? It's beyond my knowledge base to tell you who's right and who's wrong. The American and European court systems are going to determine that, and hopefully we get that result this year. It'll be very interesting, and that will have impacts on how they start up their second project.
Yeah. Do you think the U.S. government can get involved because it's the reputation of U.S. companies on the line and U.S. LNG exports, or not really?
I think the courts will get involved. I don't see why the administration would get involved at all. It doesn't really concern them. It's not really what the U.S. government will do, right?
Because I think in the past, some European companies have tried to pressure, at the time, the Biden administration to do something. But that's just a thought.
Yeah, look, I mean, FERC's role is really to look at the project and determine whether it's operating and it's operating safely. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody declares force majeure on the construction or says that The plant itself is not ready for commercial operations. The FERC will look at it and say, if you say it for these reasons, then fine. We're not going to be the arbiters of whether it is or whether it isn't, right? So we received your notice. Thank you very much. Do what you need to do to fix what you've got.
Yeah.
And they have to file reports every month about how many cargoes they produced, how much gas they took in, and a whole series of other things. And then they're publicly available. But they have produced 300 cargoes. They produced somewhere between 9.5 and 10 million tons of LNG last year, which I don't know under what term of force majeure that qualifies. I've never seen a force majeure that has people producing and doesn't make good on their contracts.
Yeah.
But again, the courts will determine, who owes what at the end of all of this.
Yeah. So I'll need to hear the version of Venture Global and their perspective. As I would mention just that since you were a former competitor, there is no dialogue here or debate. So I'm not the one who can say yes or no.
No, and I doubt anybody at Venture Global or Shell or BP can talk to you about any of it until the case is resolved, right?
Yeah.
So,
correct. Yeah.
And look, I say this with my limited knowledge of the actual proceedings and only on the basis of, my own assessments. But what I can tell you is, and I've said this any number of times over the last 5 to 7 years, and anybody who heard me say it 7 years ago is probably tired of hearing me say it. A project costs what it costs to build, and the financing cost is the same for all of us. Like we don't get good friend discounts from banks, right? If you get a BB credit rating, you know what you're paying for that. If you get a BBB credit rating, you know what you pay for that. If you have a better cost of capital, it's because you're a financially healthier company. Now, for your construction costs, you definitely don't get the good friend discount. Bechtel is going to charge you what it charges you. And I know that, some people that haven't used Bechtel in the past have said, oh, but Bechtel's expensive and they're going to, put contingencies on contingencies. But you know what? They do it right. They build it right. They build it correctly. And any of the projects that have been on time, on budget, for the most part, have come from Bechtel. And so you end up paying for it another way. And at the end of the day, the cost differential is going to be somewhere between 5 and 15%. And actually, the killer is time. So the longer it takes you to do it, the more your cost overruns will be. So that's it. So like I could tell you what it costs to build a project, what all those units cost. And I couldn't figure out how you make a return based on the contract structures that the market was proposing at the time. And still make it worthwhile to do your business.
So let's move to tariffs. We're back into a kind of trade wars, tariffs mood. And back at Tellurian, I remember vividly when Prime Minister Modi visited Houston, Texas. It was September 2019. And at the time, it was just after a big wave of tension between the US and India. So it was already, it was under the first Trump administration. And as a way to kind of mend the relationship, Modi US visit, one of the big hits was his visit to Houston and signing an agreement, a deal with Tellurian at the time, Driftwood LNG, for a contract, which I think the value was about 2.5 billion, and it was like 5 million tons of LNG, which is a big contract. And eventually the contract got canceled or never got finalized. Can you tell us a little bit, how do you think the politicization of US LNG played there? And was it at the end detrimental to the project?
Yeah, it was. It was. I think ultimately it ended up being detrimental to the project. We signed a memorandum of understanding with Petronet specifically, and Prime Minister Modi was there to witness the signing of the memorandum of understanding. And then we worked really hard over the next 6 months with Petronet to try to formalize the agreement. we'd also signed an agreement with Total 3 months earlier or 4 months earlier, and we're trying to get the next customers in for for the project, and it was an equity based project. But if you remember, as we were working through that, this is sort of after that September, we get to January, and we exited January at $4 an MMBTU with for global gas prices, with China going on lockdown for COVID.
So yeah,
Discussions about whether the rest of the world was going to follow suit, if cases of COVID were going to start appearing in different places. And by February, it was clear it was appearing in Europe. And then by March, Europeans were locking down, Americans were locking down, and prices had gone from, $8, $9 an MMBTU, sort of the previous summer, down to $4 by the end of January, which in winter is, super low. And so what we were proposing to the Indians was buy 5 million tons from us, and your delivered price to India was going to be around 6. And so they're looking at the current market price of 4 and going, why are we going to pay 6 when we can pay 4?
yeah.
And that, more than anything, is what killed that deal.
So price competitiveness. But also, do you think that Modi had in mind, okay, we're going to curry some favor with the Trump administration. He's going to leave us alone for a little while, and maybe we'll finalize the deal, or maybe we will never finalize it, but we would have gained some time.
I think it was that plus any number of other things. Because remember, Trump also went to India in sort of February or March, and then there was also that big what was it, like, it was in Houston where they had that big, they hired out the stadium, and it was a big like India rally with Modi,
Right.
and then Trump and Modi were walking around, and Modi played it really well, right? I mean, he basically said, look, Trump and I are solid. He held his hand, and they walked around holding hands for a while, right?
Yeah.
And then Trump went to India in I think it was March, because we were hoping we were going to sign a deal on the back, finalize a deal with Petronet on the back of that visit. And that visit was just a big nothing, right? It was more sort of handshaking and seeing industry, but not actually doing any deals.
Yeah. I hope the people from the second administration go back to what happened at the first administration and realize that not everything has worked out in terms of those trade LNG deals, that were supposedly big back then. And, a few years later, if you look, whether it's China, whether it's India, in terms of tangible results, right? It's not clear that they have all panned out what was expected.
Yeah, but look, even the Biden administration said they were going to send, they're going to send all this LNG from the U.S. to Europe, right? And did any deals get done because the Biden administration said we're sending, we're going to send LNG to Europe? No. But all of a sudden, the price dynamics changed, and a bunch of cargoes that were supposed to end up in Asia ended up getting priced out of Asia and ended up in Europe. And he's like, look, Biden's like, look, we've sent 15 million tons of additional LNG to Europe this year. Look at us. Like, we did what we said we were going to do.
Right.
The thing I've noticed in this industry more than anything else is everywhere else in the world, there's a very strong link between the government and its energy industry. And some government and industry in general, right? They're like, oh, go meet the people in the government. They'll help broker a deal with our companies. Oftentimes there's a state-owned or a quasi-state-owned company in which, you're going to do your deal. In the United States, it doesn't work that way, right? The United States goes and talks to Saudi Arabia, for instance, and says, okay, yeah, we've got $100 billion that we're going to work together on. It's going to encompass weapons. It's going to encompass aircraft. It's going to have infrastructure, construction, energy. And, they count off all these things, and they're like, okay, now go make the deals. And
Yeah.
then it's
So
up to...
they are sent to each individual private companies in the US.
That's right. And so then all the US private companies sit there and apply to, the Saudis after that and say, hey, you just signed this deal with the US government. Can 5 billion of it be with our company, and they'll have a beauty contest for which company in the US is better looking for a $5 billion deal. I mean, that's kind of how it works.
Yeah. No, very interesting. Good. Let's move to your personal trajectory, Tarek. I think we'll, on the political side, we'll have to come back at the end of the Trump administration to see what was the success rate.
Yeah, well, look, before we get to that, last thing I'll say on that, the US is really good at sort of grabbing headlines and trying to make deals. I mean, I think if you look at what's going on at the conference this week, that's everybody, there are a lot of headlines, and everybody's using it to get their headlines out. What it will mean, at the end of the day, business is business, and you've got to figure out how much things cost and will they make a return. And for US companies, it's actually that simple.
Yeah. I mean, to my earlier point, US LNG projects are commercially driven. Some projects around the world are politically driven, whether it's Russia or Iran, potentially one day they get to that or whenever, or other other places that have a political agenda, which is very different from the US. And that's why, like, my big theory is that we have to invest in the US also because we don't want all the eggs to go into those countries that have political agenda that are not aligned with our values. Because then it means that there is a concentration of wealth in these countries, and we are not. They don't, they can use this wealth to wage war, militarily or ideologically on our democracies and so on. So, like, for me, that's something to keep in mind. That's why I think in the US, if the government can help, maybe not the same way, with a state-owned company, but other ways, I think it's helpful if for those kind of projects to get off the ground.
If you can find a way to make the government look good, they will help you.
Yeah. Good. So let's move to your personal trajectory.
Sure.
So, Tarek, when I've known you for a couple of years, and something that strikes me is that you've been working with your father. For people that have not made the connection, your father is Charif Souki, who was one of the pioneer actually in the US LNG industry, a businessman, renowned businessman, and he actually saw before anybody else the opportunity of switching around from the US as an importer of natural gas to becoming an exporter of natural gas, and change around the business model, first with Sabine Pass, the Sabine Pass LNG project, and jumped on the opportunity. And I think that's pretty much at that time that you joined Cheniere Energy.
That's correct.
So tell us a little bit, how is it to make the decision to work with a family member? And I'm very familiar with this concept because I've been working with my husband for 6 years. We started a company together. And my family has also a family business, and some of my siblings are working with my father. So I'm actually curious to hear your why.
So the why for me had nothing to do actually with my dad himself at the time, right? I was a banker at the time. I was working at Credit Suisse. I was financing resource projects. I spent some time in the energy group, then on the commodity desk. But even on the commodity desk, I was financing oil and gas projects, mining projects. We would hedge the output of whatever the project was. And Cheniere at the time was flagging, right? It had gone from this regas facility to being, basically being drowned by the shale revolution. And so from 2008, I joined Credit Suisse in 2007 to 2012. Cheniere was struggling to figure out how they were going to turn this useless regas facility into something else. And I remember my father and I were having dinner one night, and he's telling me about liquefaction. And he told me, and I asked him, okay, regas cost you $2 billion. You guys are on the, your market cap is now $150 million. How much is a liquefaction plant going to cost? He said 10 billion. And I remember I took my pen out of my pocket and I started writing on a paper napkin, and I started doing like $10 billion return on assets. Da, 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 da. And I'm like, okay, so if this works, your $150 million market cap company should be worth at some point between 10 and $15 billion just on the market cap. And he says, yes. And I looked at him and I said, okay, I want in.
You saw an opportunity.
That's it. It was really down to that, and it was exciting that what they were doing. Now, even after that, it took probably 12 months from that, because that was in 2011, and it took me 12 months to finally get approval from their board of directors to let me join the company.
I think it's very good that you had a prior experience, your own expertise before joining, right? Because it prevents, the imposter syndrome in some ways, or coming in with your own credibility.
It helped a lot. And frankly, for the first, when I was at Cheniere, I was there for 3 years before they saw fit to ask us to no longer work there. I didn't even work directly for him. I worked for Meg Gentle, who was the EVP of marketing at the time, and then went on to become the first CEO of Tellurian. And so it wasn't until I was at Tellurian that I was working pretty much directly with him as an executive on the executive team at the firm.
Yeah, I would say that I found out that as entrepreneur, it's very common actually to work with family members, whether it's your spouse, your partner, siblings, or best buddies. Why? I mean, for me, it's because you need people that you trust around you, and also very dedicated, that are highly committed. Was it the case for you? Like, you felt that, especially with Tellurian, which was, a closer circle around your father?
Yeah, look, I went through all the banking. I did my MBA. I went through banking. I went through the hardcore, kill you sort of banking, where you had weeks where 30-day stretches of never leaving the office and things like that. Hard work wasn't an issue. It's, and I agree with you. There is a level of trust with your family members, and I'll use a little humor here. Right now in Hollywood, everybody talks about Nepo babies, right? That's like all, I don't know if you've seen this term, but it's like all the children of former stars or stars, or, they're like, my children are now actors and actresses. And to be honest with you, it makes a lot of sense, because it's not just in Hollywood, right? I mean, how many musicians have talented musicians for children? Maybe they're not rock stars like their parents, but they grew up learning how to play an instrument, and they grew up with music all the time. If you're an actor.
Last night I was watching the stand-up show from Jamie Foxx, and he brought in his daughter with the guitar, right?
Right, it's like, and who
opening her the gates, Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't you give your kid that kind of an opportunity if you could? I mean, Pink brought her daughter out on stage to sing with her. Look, Gwyneth Paltrow is the daughter of an actress on the mom's side, and on her father's side, a producer, right? I mean, it's like they grew up in the industry, but nobody seems to say that when it's an accountant, right? I mean, how many accountants, you're French, Leslie, how many père et fils, how many wineries have like father and son and pass down generations?
I think historically you were learning the craft from your father, right? So
that's right.
You were a shoemaker, or from son to father.
Yeah. So it's natural, right? But look, I have 4 siblings, and I'm the only one who went into the energy business. I'm the oldest of 4 or 5. And I'm the only one who went to the energy business. My 2 brothers also work with my dad, but more on the family side. than on the
Yeah.
energy side. I'm the only one who
Yeah.
went took that direction.
Mhm. I mean, I
So
think family businesses in itself are kind of a jewel for the economy, because it's kind of a different business model, and usually they are surviving I mean, some of them generation after generations, and it, they are it's not the same quick gain or selling, and it's not the same mentality.
no, I mean, look at Bechtel, right? Bechtel is one of the biggest construction and engineering firms in the world. And that's a fifth generation company. I mean, Brendan is the fifth Bechtel to take the helm of that company.
Hmm. Very,
Yep.
very interesting. I didn't know that many generation. Very interesting. Good.
It goes back to his great grandfather. Maybe that's the
Good.
fourth. I have
Yeah.
to do my math on that.
Yeah, great. Well, let's see what the future holds for family businesses in the energy sector, and maybe we'll talk again soon on this note. Thank you so much, Tarek, and I'll talk to you soon.
Anytime, Leslie. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. This episode was recorded on March 13, 2025. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.